The candles in the great dining hall of Blackwood Hall burned low, their wax pooling into copper trays like frozen tears. 24 chairs lined the oak table, only one was occupied. Duke Cassian Keverell sat at the head, his napkin folded across his lap, his silver fork resting between his fingers like a weapon he had long stopped believing in. Before him, a plate of roasted lamb shoulder glistened with rosemary butter. It smelled, according to everyone else in the household, extraordinary. To Cassian, it smelled like nothing. It tasted like nothing. It had tasted like nothing for 3 years. He cut a piece, placed it on his tongue, chewed slowly, and swallowed. He might as well have been eating wet paper. He set the fork down without a sound and stared at the chandelier above him, counting its 46 crystals the way a man in prison counts the stones of his cell wall. 3 years ago, a sudden illness had swept through his body like a fire through dry timber. The physicians called it a nervous fever. It stole his balance for weeks, his vision for days, and when it finally released him from bed, it took something else with it. His ability to taste. Every flavor, every sensation on his tongue, gone. Roast beef, honeyed pears, salted broth, black tea, all reduced to the same dull emptiness. The doctors had tried everything, mineral salts, herbal pastes. A specialist from Edinburgh had pressed burning cloves against his tongue and declared the condition permanent. And so Cassian had accepted it, the way he accepted everything else in his life, quietly and alone. He pushed the plate away and rang the small bell beside his glass. A footman appeared within seconds. "Your Grace?" "Remove it." "Was the lamb not to your satisfaction, sir?" "It was fine. Remove it." The footman obeyed without another word. Cassian turned his chair toward the tall windows that overlooked the south gardens. Frost had crawled across the glass in jagged patterns. December in Derbyshire had no mercy. Downstairs, in the wide stone kitchen beneath the main hall, a young woman with dark hair pinned beneath a plain cotton cap was scrubbing a copper pot with sand and vinegar. Her name, according to the staff register, was Prudence Marsh. She had arrived 4 days ago with a letter of reference from a parish house in Whitby and a quiet manner that made her nearly invisible among the other kitchen workers. Her real name was Maeve Thorne. She had come to Blackwood Hall for one reason, and it had nothing to do with cooking. 3 years ago, her father, Corin Thorne, had served as the Duke's head chef, a position he had held with pride for over a decade. He was known across the county for his extraordinary skill, his knowledge of rare herbs, and the loyalty he carried for the Keverell family. Then, one evening, during a formal dinner for the Duke's most important guests, the meal went horribly wrong. The main course was laced with a bitter, foul-tasting substance that left every guest choking and spitting into their napkins. The Duke himself had collapsed at the table. Corin Thorne was blamed. He was dismissed that same night, dragged from the kitchen in front of the entire staff, his name blackened without trial or hearing. Within a week, he had vanished from public life entirely. Within a year, he was gone, broken by shame, living in a single rented room above a tanner's shop in a village that didn't even know his name. Maeve had been 15 years old. Now she was 18, and she had spent every day of those 3 years preparing for this moment. She had studied her father's recipes. She had trained under her uncle Gideon, an apothecary in the coastal village of Oakhaven, learning every herb, every root, every combination her father had ever written in his personal ledger, and she had come to Blackwood Hall under a false name with a single, burning question lodged in her chest like a splinter. Who had truly poisoned that meal? Because she knew, with the certainty of someone who had grown up watching her father cook since before she could walk, that Corin Thorne had never made a mistake in his kitchen. Someone else had ruined that dish. Someone inside this house. Tonight, opportunity had arrived without warning. The new head cook, Mrs. Barlow, had fallen ill with a stomach ailment after supper. The undercook had burned his hand on a kettle, and the Duke's evening meal, a simple roasted pheasant with seasonal garnish, had been left half-prepared on the long wooden table when the kitchen emptied out. Maeve stood over the bird, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew she shouldn't touch it. A scullery maid had no business preparing the Duke's personal meal. If she was caught, she would be dismissed, or worse, questioned. But she also knew something that nobody else in this kitchen understood. Her father's signature blend, dried sea lavender harvested from the Norfolk coast, ground with wild marjoram picked before the first frost, had a property that no physician in England had ever documented. It stimulated the palate at a depth that went beyond ordinary seasoning. Her father had discovered it by accident while cooking for a retired naval officer who had lost his sense of taste after a long fever at sea. 3 meals later, the officer could taste again. If the Duke's illness had damaged his palate the way Maeve suspected, this blend could wake it up. She reached into the small cloth pouch she kept hidden inside the lining of her apron, the one thing she had carried from her father's kitchen, and dusted the pheasant with the pale lavender-gray powder. She finished the preparation with steady hands, arranged the plate with care, and sent it upstairs through the serving hatch with a silent prayer caught between her teeth. 20 minutes later, the bell rang again from the dining hall, but this time it rang 3 times in quick succession, the signal for the cook to appear personally before the Duke. Maeve's blood went cold. She wiped her hands on her apron, straightened her cap, and climbed the narrow stone staircase to the great dining hall. The footman held the door open for her without expression. Cassian Keverell stood at the far end of the room. He was not sitting. He was standing beside his chair, one hand gripping the back of it, the other hanging at his side. The plate of pheasant sat on the table, a single bite missing from the breast. His face was pale, his jaw was tight, and his eyes, sharp, dark, deeply unsettled, were fixed on her with an intensity that made the air between them feel thin. "Come closer," he said. Maeve walked forward. She kept her hands clasped in front of her and her gaze low, the way a kitchen maid was expected to. "Did you prepare this dish?" he asked.
"Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Barlow took ill and the kitchen was left without—"
"What did you put in it?"
"Pheasant, Your Grace, with rosemary, a touch of thyme, and a light seasoning of—"
"Do not lie to me." His voice was quiet, controlled, but underneath it, something was shaking loose, something that had been sealed behind a wall for 3 long years. Because for the first time since his illness, Duke Cassian Keverell had tasted something. One bite of roasted pheasant, and flavor had crashed back into his mouth like a wave breaking over dry rocks. Salt, fat, smoke, herb, warmth, memory. He stepped closer, close enough that the candlelight caught the faint tremor in his hand. "Who are you?" he whispered. Maeve looked up and met his eyes, and for a terrible, breathless moment, she had no answer at all. Maeve held his gaze for as long as she dared, then dropped her eyes to the floor.
"My name is Prudence Marsh, Your Grace. I arrived 4 days ago from Whitby. The housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, took me on as scullery help for the winter season."
"That is not what I asked." Cassian stepped around the edge of the table, his boots quiet against the polished stone. He stopped an arm's length from her and studied her face the way a man studies a document he suspects has been forged, searching for the seam, the flaw, the place where the truth bleeds through. "The seasoning on that pheasant," he said. "Where did you learn it?" Maeve had rehearsed this answer 100 times during sleepless nights in her uncle's cottage. She delivered it without hesitation. "A traveling cook passed through our village 2 summers ago. He stayed at the inn for a fortnight and taught several of the local women his techniques. I picked up a few of his methods." "A traveling cook?"
"Yes, Your Grace."
Cassian was silent for a long moment. Then he turned away from her and walked to the window, pressing his palm flat against the frosted glass as though testing whether the cold was still real.
3 years ago, he said quietly,
I employed a man named Corin Thorne as my head chef. He served this household for 11 years. In all that time, he used a particular blend of dried herbs, sea lavender from the Norfolk marshes, combined with wild marjoram picked before the first October frost. He told me once that the combination existed nowhere else in England, that he had developed it himself over the course of a decade, that he had written it down in only one place, a personal ledger he kept locked in his quarters. He turned back to face her. And tonight, for the first time in 3 years, I tasted that exact blend on my plate, prepared by a scullery maid from Whitby who claims she learned it from a nameless stranger at a village inn. Maeve said nothing. Her pulse was loud in her ears, and her fingers, still clasped in front of her apron, had gone white at the knuckles. Cassian watched her silence the way a hunter watches a rabbit deciding which direction to run. "You will not leave this estate,"
he said.
"Effective immediately, you are relieved of scullery duties. You will serve as my personal cook until I am satisfied that I understand who you are and where you come from."
"Your Grace, I am only a kitchen maid. I have no qualification to—"
That was not a request.
He rang the bell twice. The footman reappeared, and Cassian gave instructions in a tone that left no room for discussion. Prudence Marsh was to be moved from the shared servants' dormitory to the single room beside the kitchen stores. She was to have access to the full pantry and herb garden. She was not to leave the grounds of Blackwood Hall for any reason without the Duke's written permission. When the footman left, Cassian turned to her one final time.
"You will prepare my breakfast at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Use whatever ingredients you see fit."
Then he walked past her and disappeared through the far door without looking back.
Maeve stood alone in the great dining hall, surrounded by dying candlelight and the faint smell of roasted pheasant, and let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped inside her chest for 3 years. She had wanted to get close to the Duke. She had wanted access to the estate's inner workings, but she had not expected it to happen like this, pulled into the light before she had found a single thread of evidence. Now she was trapped, promoted, watched, and confined to the very house where her father's life had been destroyed. The following morning, before the household stirred, Cassian sat in his private study on the second floor and penned a short note on thick cream paper. He folded it, sealed it with wax, and placed it on the silver tray beside his inkwell. When Archambault Pendleton arrived at 6:30, punctual as always, his gray waistcoat buttoned to the collar, his ledger book tucked beneath his arm, Cassian handed him the note without greeting. "I want you to find out everything about the girl who cooked my meal last night. Her name is Prudence Marsh. She claims to have come from Whitby with a parish reference. Verify it. I want to know her family, her village, her movements for the last 2 years. Send a man to Whitby if necessary." Pendleton opened the note, read its contents, and folded it again with steady hands. "May I ask what prompted this concern, Your Grace?" "She used a seasoning I have not encountered since Corin Thorne's time." Something passed across Pendleton's face, quick and faint, like a shadow crossing a window on a cloudy day. He tucked the note into his waistcoat pocket and offered a measured nod. "Thorne's recipes were well regarded in the county. It is possible the technique spread beyond this household during his years of service."
"It did not spread. Thorne told me so himself. He kept his methods private."
"Thorne told you many things, Your Grace. Not all of them proved reliable." The words settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. Cassian looked at his steward, a man who had served the Keverell estate for nearly 15 years, who had managed the accounts, the tenants, the staff, and the correspondence with a precision that bordered on mechanical. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something stir at the base of his instinct. He could not name it yet. It was too faint, too buried beneath years of trust and routine. But it was there, a whisper of doubt, thin as smoke. "Find out who she is," Cassian repeated. "Report to me directly. No one else is to be informed of this inquiry." "Of course, Your Grace." Pendleton bowed and left the study. His footsteps faded down the corridor with their usual measured rhythm. each one landing at precisely the same interval as the last. Alone again, Cassian opened the top drawer of his writing desk and removed a small, leather-bound journal, one of the few personal effects Corin Thorne had left behind when he was dismissed. It contained no recipes, only personal reflections and scattered notes about ingredients sourced from various markets across the north. Cassian had kept it out of sentiment more than anything else. Thorne had been more than a servant to him. He had been a companion during the long, solitary years after Cassian's parents had died, a steady presence in a household that often felt more like a mausoleum than a home. He opened the journal to a page near the back, where Thorne had sketched a small bundle of dried sea lavender in faded ink, accompanied by a single line of handwriting. For memory, for warmth, for the ones who forget how to feel. Cassian closed the journal and pressed his thumb against the worn leather cover. Somewhere below him, in the kitchen that still carried the ghost of Corin Thorne's presence, a young woman who called herself Prudence was already lighting the stove. By the third day, Maeve had memorized the rhythm of Blackwood Hall, the way her father had once taught her to memorize the timing of a slow braised stew, by listening, by watching, and by never letting anyone see that she was doing either. The household woke at 5:30. The maids swept the corridors and laid the fires by 6. Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper, conducted her inspection of the lower rooms at 1:15, her ring of iron keys jangling against her hip like a set of small bells. The footman carried coal and polished silver until breakfast service began at 7, and Archambault Pendleton arrived at the Duke's study at precisely 6:30 every morning, his leather ledger pressed to his chest, his thin mouth set in that particular expression of calm authority that Maeve had learned to recognize as a mask. She had known his face the moment she set foot in Blackwood Hall. 4 days ago, during her first hour on the estate, she had passed him in the corridor outside the servants' hall. He had glanced at her the way one glances at a piece of furniture, briefly, without interest, and continued walking. He did not recognize her. Why would he? The last time he had seen her, she had been a thin, frightened girl of 15, standing behind her father in the kitchen doorway, while Corin Thorne was accused, stripped of his position, and escorted from the premises by 2 footmen who would not meet his eyes. Maeve had stood in that doorway and watched her father walk out into the rain without his coat, carrying nothing except the small leather satchel that held his personal recipe ledger. And standing behind the Duke's chair that night, overseeing the entire dismissal with the composed efficiency of a man conducting routine business, had been Archambault Pendleton. She had never forgotten his face, the narrow jaw, the pale gray eyes that moved like a clerk's pen, always calculating, always recording, never resting. Now those same eyes were following her. It began on the second morning, small enough to dismiss. Pendleton appeared in the kitchen corridor while Maeve was carrying a tray of breakfast dishes, and he paused at the far end, pretending to examine a supply list pinned to the notice board. He stood there for nearly 5 minutes. When Maeve looked up from her work, he was watching her hands. That afternoon, she found the door to the herb pantry ajar when she was certain she had latched it after her morning preparation. Nothing was missing, but the jars on the second shelf had been shifted, moved forward by an inch, as though someone had reached behind them to check the wall. On the third afternoon, Maeve decided to test her suspicion. She told Mrs. Calloway that she needed to gather winter herbs from the glass house, a long, narrow structure of iron and glass that stood at the eastern edge of the estate gardens, where the kitchen staff grew thyme, sage, and parsley through the colder months. She wrapped herself in her wool shawl, took a wicker basket, and walked the gravel path through the frosted garden at a pace slow enough to be observed. She spent 20 minutes in the glass house, cutting rosemary and sorting dried lavender into cloth pouches. Through the fogged panes, she watched the main house. Nobody came. Then she walked back. She entered through the kitchen passage, climbed the narrow staircase to the servants' quarters, and turned the corner toward the small room she had been assigned beside the kitchen stores. The door was open. Maeve stopped 3 steps from the threshold. She could hear the faint creak of a floorboard inside, the particular board near the foot of the bed that groaned when weight shifted across it. She pressed her back against the wall and leaned just far enough to see through the gap between the door and its frame. Archambault Pendleton was kneeling beside her wooden trunk. He had lifted the lid and was sorting through her belongings with the careful, practiced hands of a man who had searched other people's things before. Her spare dress, her cotton stockings, her prayer book, each item removed, examined, and replaced with a precision designed to leave no visible trace. He was looking for something specific. Maeve could tell by the way his fingers lingered at the bottom of the trunk, pressing along the seams of the lining, checking for hidden compartments. He was looking for her father's recipe ledger. Maeve pulled back from the doorway and pressed her hand over her mouth. Her breathing was shallow, and she forced herself to steady it before it gave her away. She retreated silently down the corridor, descended the stairs, and walked into the kitchen with her basket of herbs as though nothing had happened. She set the rosemary on the cutting board and began stripping the needles with a small knife, her movements calm and deliberate. But inside, everything had shifted. Pendleton was not simply investigating her on the Duke's orders. A steward conducting a routine inquiry would have sent a letter to Whitby, checked her parish reference, and reported back. He would not be searching her personal belongings. He would not be looking for a dead chef's private writings. He was afraid. Maeve understood the shape of it now, the way she understood the shape of a dish before she began cooking, by instinct, by the logic of ingredients that only made sense when combined. Pendleton had framed her father. He had introduced the bitter substance into the meal that night, knowing it would ruin the feast and that the head chef would take the blame. Why? Maeve did not yet know the full reason, but the fear in his movements told her everything about the stakes. Whatever Pendleton had done went deeper than a single poisoned dish. He had something to protect, something that would collapse the moment the Duke began asking the right questions. And the Duke was asking questions now. Because Maeve's cooking had done exactly what she had hoped. It had unlocked something in Cassian Keverill's memory, a door that Pendleton had spent 3 years keeping sealed. She finished stripping the rosemary and gathered the needles into a small clay bowl. Through the kitchen window, she could see the gravel path that led to the glass house, and beyond it, the low stone wall that marked the boundary of the estate. She could leave. She could slip out tonight, abandon the false name, and disappear before Pendleton discovered who she truly was. But her father's name was still buried under a lie. And somewhere in this house, in a ledger, a receipt, a letter tucked inside a drawer, the proof of that lie was waiting. Maeve wiped the knife clean and set it beside the bowl. She was not leaving Blackwood Hall. She was going deeper. On the 4th evening, Cassian requested something unusual. He sent word through the footman that he wished to dine in the small private dining room adjacent to his study rather than the great hall. The room seated only 4 and had not been used in months. More importantly, he requested a specific dish, a slow-simmered bone broth with root vegetables and fresh herbs, served with warm bread and unsalted butter. Maeve received the instruction and understood immediately what he was doing. Bone broth was the simplest of preparations, yet the most revealing. Every flaw in seasoning would announce itself in a clear broth, the way a wrong note announces itself in a quiet room. He was testing her again, stripping away the complexity of roasted meats and heavy sauces to see whether her skill held when there was nowhere to hide. She welcomed it. The broth would also serve her own purpose. Her father's journals contained detailed observations about how certain herb combinations could gradually restore sensitivity to a damaged palate. The sea lavender blend had been the first key, a sharp awakening. The second step required something gentler, a slow infusion of wild celery leaf and white pepper, simmered for 3 hours at a temperature just below boiling, so the oils released without turning bitter. If her father's theory was correct, This broth would deepen what the pheasant had begun, pulling more of Cassian's buried senses back toward the surface. She began the preparation at 2:30, knowing she would need the full afternoon. She selected marrow bones from the cold store, split them cleanly with a cleaver, and set them in a deep iron pot with cold water drawn from the courtyard well. She added a single onion, halved and charred over the open flame until its skin blackened, along with a knob of ginger root and a thumb-length piece of dried turmeric. While the pot simmered on the low fire, she went to the herb pantry to gather the celery leaf and white pepper. The moment she opened the pantry door, she knew something was wrong. The jars on the second shelf had been rearranged again. The dried celery leaf was in its usual place, but the small brown jar of ground white pepper had been moved from the far left to the center of the shelf, positioned directly beside a jar of powdered gentian root, one of the most intensely bitter substances used in traditional medicine. Maeve picked up the white pepper jar and removed the cork. She brought it to her nose and inhaled carefully. The smell was wrong. White pepper carried a clean, sharp heat that announced itself immediately. This jar smelled flat, with a faint medicinal undertone that clung to the back of the throat. She tipped a tiny amount onto her fingertip and touched it to her tongue. Gentian. Mixed into the pepper at a ratio careful enough to pass a casual glance, but strong enough to ruin any dish it touched. One spoonful of this in the broth, and the entire pot would turn so bitter it would be undrinkable. A cook who used it without checking would serve a foul meal and have no explanation for what went wrong. Maeve stood very still in the pantry doorway, the contaminated jar in her hand, and let the full weight of it settle over her. Pendleton had done this. He had tampered with the spice stores, the same spice stores that only he and the kitchen staff had keys to access. He had chosen gentian root because it was already present in the household's medicinal supplies, meaning its purchase would raise no suspicion. And he had placed it in the white pepper because he had watched Maeve work long enough to know her methods. He knew she favored white pepper over black. He had paid attention. This was the same technique, the same sabotage, the same bitter agent that had destroyed her father's feast 3 years ago. Maeve's hand trembled around the jar. For a moment, a wave of anger so fierce it frightened her rose through her chest and pressed against her ribs. She wanted to walk upstairs, place the jar on Cassian's desk, and tell him everything. Her name, her father's disgrace, the steward who had engineered it all. But she forced the impulse down. One contaminated jar of pepper proved nothing on its own. Pendleton would deny it. He would claim the jars had been mixed up by a careless kitchen maid. He would turn the accusation back on her, and she, a girl working under a false name with a forged parish reference, would lose everything before she had gained anything at all. She needed patience. She needed evidence that could not be denied or redirected. Maeve returned the tampered jar to the shelf, positioning it exactly where she had found it, so that Pendleton would believe his plan was still undiscovered. From the lower shelf, she retrieved a sealed pouch of whole white peppercorns, untouched, still tied with the supplier's string, and ground them fresh using the stone mortar beside the cutting board. She completed the broth with clean ingredients, adjusting the celery leaf infusion by hand, tasting as she went. By 6:30, the liquid was golden and clear, fragrant with a warmth that filled the kitchen corridor and drew 2 of the housemaids to the doorway with curious expressions. At 7 o'clock, the broth was served. Maeve did not go upstairs this time. She waited in the kitchen, standing beside the fire with her arms folded across her apron, listening to the silence above her. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The footman returned with the tray. The bowl was empty. Beside it, on the small china saucer, Cassian had placed a folded note. Maeve opened it. The handwriting was firm and unhurried. The same hand made this. I am certain of it now. Tomorrow we will speak plainly. She read it twice, then held the edge of the paper to the candle flame and watched it curl into ash. Cassian's palate was returning. Each meal she prepared was pulling him further out of the numbness that had sealed him away for 3 years, and with every flavor that resurfaced, his memory would follow. Memories of the night he fell ill, of the meal that preceded it, of the man who had stood behind his chair and watched it all happen with gray, calculating eyes. Maeve scraped the ash from the table into her palm and dusted it into the fire. Pendleton's sabotage had failed tonight. He would discover that soon enough, and when he did, he would try again, with something less subtle, something more desperate. She needed to move faster than his fear. On the 5th night, Maeve waited until the household fell asleep. She lay on her narrow bed beside the kitchen stores, fully dressed beneath the wool blanket, listening to the sounds of Blackwood Hall settling into darkness. The last maid's footsteps faded at 10:15. Mrs. Calloway's door closed at past. The footman on night watch completed his final round of the ground floor at 11, his lantern throwing a thin line of yellow light beneath Maeve's door as he passed. Then the house went quiet, and the only sound left was the ticking of the long case clock in the servants' corridor, counting out the minutes like a slow, mechanical heartbeat. At midnight, Maeve pushed back the blanket and stood. She had packed her things an hour earlier, a small leather satchel containing a clean dress, a handful of coins she had saved from 2 years of mending work in Whitby, and a letter she had written to her Uncle Gideon 3 weeks before arriving at Blackwood Hall. In the letter, she had told him that if she ever came to Oakhaven without warning, he should have their father's original recipe ledger ready and ask no questions until they were behind a locked door. The ledger was the one piece of evidence that could prove everything. Her father had kept it for over 20 years, a thick, cloth-bound book filled with his personal recipes, ingredient lists, and detailed notes on every meal he had prepared during his time at Blackwood Hall. More importantly, the ledger contained precise records of the herb blends he had used on the night of the ruined feast. If Maeve could place those records beside the Duke's household accounts, she could demonstrate that the bitter substance found in the food that evening did not match anything Corin Thorne had purchased or stored. The contamination had come from outside his kitchen. The ledger was the proof, and it was sitting in her uncle's apothecary shop in Oakhaven, 12 miles to the east along the Valley Road. Maeve opened her window. The frame was old and the latch stiff, but she had loosened it over the previous 2 nights with a few drops of cooking oil applied to the hinges before bed. The window swung open without a sound, letting in a rush of December air that stung her cheeks and turned her breath to mist. She climbed out onto the low stone ledge, dropped into the kitchen garden below, and crouched behind the row of dormant lavender bushes that lined the garden wall. The moon was a thin crescent, offering just enough light to navigate by, but not enough to expose her against the dark grounds. She crossed the garden, passed through the gate in the stone wall, and followed the tree line along the eastern boundary of the estate. The frost had hardened the ground, and her boots made a faint crunching sound with each step. She kept close to the hedgerow, where the frozen grass was softer and her footprints would be less visible by morning. At the far edge of the estate, where the Keverell lands met the public road, a coaching inn called the Grey Lamb kept a small livery stable. Maeve had visited it on her second day at Blackwood Hall, under the pretense of posting a letter, and had arranged with the stable boy to hire a horse and light trap for the price of 2 shillings, payable upon departure, no questions asked. The boy was asleep in the hayloft when she arrived. She woke him with a tap on the stable door, pressed the coins into his hand, and within 10 minutes was seated on the bench of a narrow 2-wheeled trap behind a brown mare with a patient temperament and steady legs. The road to Oakhaven wound east through the Derbyshire Valley, following the course of a shallow river that gleamed like hammered tin under the moonlight. The countryside was silent. No other travelers moved on the road at this hour. The only company was the occasional cry of a barn owl hunting across the frozen fields, and the steady rhythm of the mare's hooves on packed earth. Maeve held the reins loosely and let the horse find her own pace. There was no point in rushing. She needed to arrive at Oakhaven before dawn, collect the ledger from Gideon, and return to Blackwood Hall before the morning kitchen duties began at 5:30. If she was quick, she could be back in her room with the ledger hidden beneath the floorboard under her bed before anyone noticed her absence. That was the plan. Clean and simple, like a well-made dish, every element in its place, every step timed to the minute. But plans, as her father used to say, are only as reliable as the ingredients you start with. And Maeve had not accounted for one ingredient she could not control: the Duke himself. Cassian Keverell had not slept well in 3 years. The same illness that had stolen his sense of taste had also fractured his sleep into shallow, restless stretches, rarely lasting more than 2 or 3 hours. He often rose in the deep hours of the night and walked the corridors of Blackwood Hall in his dressing gown, reading by candlelight in the library or standing at the tall windows of the gallery, watching the darkness beyond the glass as though expecting it to explain something. Tonight, at midnight, he had gone to the kitchen. He was not entirely sure why. Perhaps it was the memory of the broth from the previous evening, the warmth of it, the way it had stirred something deep and half-forgotten in his chest that he could not quite name. Perhaps he simply wanted to stand in the room where the food had been made and breathe in whatever traces of it still lingered in the air. What he found instead was an empty bed, an open window, and a cold draft blowing through the kitchen stores. He stood in the doorway of Maeve's room, holding a single candle, and stared at the neatly folded blanket, the bare pillow, and the absence where a person should have been. His first instinct was suspicion. She had fled. She had been hiding something from the beginning, and now she had taken whatever secret she carried and disappeared into the night. His second instinct was quieter, and it surprised him. If she had meant him harm, she would not have cooked him a broth that tasted like the first true thing he had experienced in 3 years. A person who wished to deceive did not restore what had been taken. A person who wished to poison did not heal. Cassian set the candle on the windowsill and called for his horse. Oakhaven sat at the bottom of the valley where the river widened into a shallow estuary before meeting the sea. It was a small village, a single cobbled street lined with fishermen's cottages, a stone church with a square tower, a chandler's shop, and a row of low commercial buildings that faced the old wharf. In summer, the wharf bustled with herring boats and coal barges. In December, it belonged to the fog. Maeve arrived at 4:15 in the morning. The mist had rolled in from the water during the final mile of her journey, thickening until the mare's ears vanished into grey and the wheels of the trap left dark tracks on cobblestones she could barely see. She tied the horse to a post outside the chandler's and continued on foot, carrying her satchel close against her side. Gideon Thorne's apothecary shop occupied the last building on the wharf, a narrow, salt-weathered structure with green shutters and a hand-painted sign that read, "Thorne and Son, Apothecary and Herbalist, established 1782. The son referred to Maeve's father, though the name had never been removed from the sign, even after Corin's death. Gideon had told her once that taking the word down would mean admitting his brother was truly gone, and he was not prepared to do that. Maeve knocked 3 times on the side door, 2 quick raps followed by a pause and a third, the pattern Gideon had used since she was little to distinguish family from customers. A bolt slid back. The door opened to reveal a tall, thin man in his late 50s, with wire spectacles perched on his forehead and a woolen shawl draped over his nightshirt. His face, creased with sleep, changed the instant he recognized her. "Maeve." "Uncle, I need the ledger." Gideon studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside without a word. He led her through the shop, past shelves lined with brown glass bottles and ceramic jars labeled in his careful copper plate, and into the back room where he kept his personal records and the few belongings his brother had left behind. The recipe ledger was stored inside a locked oak cabinet beside the fireplace. Gideon retrieved a key from the chain around his neck, opened the cabinet, and withdrew the book with both hands, as though it were something fragile and sacred. The cloth binding had faded from deep blue to a mottled gray, and the pages were soft with age, but the contents were intact, page after page of Corin Thorne's handwriting, dense with ingredient measurements, preparation notes, and observations stretching back over 2 decades. Maeve took it and pressed it against her chest. The weight of it felt like holding her father's hand. "You found something," Gideon said. It was a statement, not a question. "I found the man who destroyed him. He is still inside that house, Uncle, still managing the accounts, still standing behind the Duke's chair, still wearing the same expression he wore the night he watched my father walk out into the rain." Gideon sat down heavily in the chair beside the fireplace. "Your father told me, near the end, that he suspected the steward. He said there were entries in the household books that did not add up, purchases made in the estate's name that never reached the kitchen. But he had no proof. He died without proof. I will find it. The ledger is the first step. Father recorded every ingredient he used on the night of the feast. If I can match those records against the estate's purchasing accounts, I can prove the bitter herb came from outside his supplies. Someone else brought it into the kitchen." "And the Duke, does he know who you are?" "He knows something. He tasted Father's blend in the dish I made and recognized it. He is asking questions, but I have not told him the truth. I cannot. If Pendleton discovers my identity before I have proof, he will find a way to have me removed. Or worse." Gideon was quiet for a moment, then reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "Your father would tell you to be careful." "My father was careful. It did not save him." She tucked the ledger into her satchel, fastened the buckle, and stood. Dawn was still an hour away, and she needed to be on the road within minutes if she had any hope of returning to Blackwood Hall before the household stirred. She kissed Gideon on the forehead, thanked him, and walked back through the darkened shop toward the side door. She opened it and stepped directly into the fog. And into Cassian Kevrel. He was standing 3 feet from the door, his riding coat damp with mist, his dark hair pushed back from his face, his horse tied beside her trap at the wharf post. He looked as though he had been waiting, patiently, deliberately, for her to emerge. Maeve's stomach dropped. She pulled the satchel tighter against her body and took a half-step back into the doorway. "Your Grace, you left the estate in the middle of the night. You rode 12 miles in freezing fog to reach an apothecary shop on a fishing wharf, and you are now carrying something in that bag that you did not have when you left." His voice was steady. There was no anger in it, no accusation. Only the careful, measured tone of a man assembling pieces in his mind and finding that they were beginning to fit. "I want the truth," he said. "Your real name, your connection to my household, and the reason you came to Blackwood Hall under a false identity to cook for a man you had never met." Maeve looked at him through the fog. His face was half lit by the lantern mounted on the wharf post, and in that pale glow she could see something she had not expected to find in the eyes of a duke. Exhaustion. The deep, settled kind that comes from years of living inside a question that nobody else can hear. He was not here to punish her. He was here because the taste of her father's food had broken something open inside him, and he needed to understand what it was. Maeve loosened her grip on the satchel. "There is an inn at the top of the street," she said quietly. "If you are willing to listen, I will tell you everything, but I need you to hear the full account before you pass judgment. Will you grant me that?" Cassian studied her face for a long breath. Then he gave a single nod. "Lead the way." The coaching inn at the top of Oakhaven's High Street was called the Anchor and Bell. At this hour, its public rooms were dark and its doors locked, but the innkeeper's wife, a stout woman named Mrs. Fenton, who had known Gideon Thorne for 30 years, answered Maeve's knock without complaint and led them to a small private parlor at the back of the building. She lit the fire, brought a pot of tea and 2 plain cups, and closed the door behind her without asking a single question. Maeve sat on one side of the oak table. Cassian sat on the other. Between them, the fire crackled and spat as the damp wood caught. For a moment, neither spoke. Maeve kept her hands wrapped around the warm cup, steadying herself. She had imagined this conversation 100 times during the years since her father's death, rehearsed it, rearranged it, polished it until every sentence sat in its proper place. Now that the moment had arrived, she found that all her prepared words had scattered like flour thrown into wind. She opened the satchel, removed the recipe ledger, and placed it on the table between them. "My name is Maeve Thorne," she said. "Corin Thorne was my father." Cassian's hand, which had been reaching for his tea, stopped halfway. He looked at the ledger, then at her face, and she watched the recognition settle across his features, slow and heavy, like snow accumulating on a branch. "Thorne had a daughter," he said quietly. "I remember. A young girl. She used to sit on a stool in the corner of the kitchen and shell broad beans while her father cooked. That was me." Cassian withdrew his hand from the cup and placed both palms flat on the table, as though bracing himself against something. "I was told, after Thorne's dismissal, that his family had moved north. I made inquiries through my solicitor, but the trail went cold within a few months. I assumed they had settled elsewhere, under different circumstances. My father moved us to a village outside Scarborough. He found work as a laborer on a farm, but the disgrace followed him. People heard the story. A head chef dismissed for poisoning a duke's table. No one would hire him to cook again. He took whatever work he could find, and it broke him piece by piece. He died 14 months after leaving Blackwood Hall." She said it plainly, without decoration. She had learned a long time ago that grief did not require embellishment. The facts were heavy enough on their own. Cassian said nothing for a long while. The fire shifted, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. "I carried guilt for your father's dismissal," he said eventually. "The evidence at the time seemed clear. The dish was prepared in his kitchen, with his ingredients, under his supervision. My steward presented a thorough account of the evening, and the guests confirmed the meal was inedible. I acted on what I believed to be true." "You acted on what you were shown. There is a difference." Maeve opened the ledger to a page near the middle, marked with a thin strip of blue ribbon. The page was filled with her father's handwriting, a detailed record of every ingredient used in the preparation of the feast on the night in question. "My father kept records of every meal he ever cooked in your household, every herb, every spice, every cut of meat, every supplier, every quantity. This page covers the night of the feast." She turned the book so that Cassian could read it. His eyes moved down the list. Pheasant, venison, root vegetables, cream, butter, thyme, rosemary, bay, juniper, white wine, bone stock. Every item was annotated with its source, its quantity, and the time at which it had been added to the preparation. "There is no gentian root on this list," Maeve said. "No bitter herb of any kind. My father never used gentian in his cooking. He considered it a medicinal ingredient, unsuitable for food. If it entered the dish that night, it did not come from his hand." Cassian studied the page in silence. His fingers traced the edge of the paper, and Maeve could see that he recognized the handwriting, the same careful, slightly slanted script that filled the small journal he had kept in his desk drawer for 3 years. "You believe the dish was sabotaged," he said. "I know it was, and I know by whom." She told him about Pendleton. She described what she had witnessed over the past 3 days, the searching of her trunk, the rearrangement of the spice jars, the contaminated white pepper she had discovered the previous afternoon. She explained that the gentian root mixed into the pepper was the same class of bitter agent that had ruined the feast 3 years ago, and that Pendleton had access to both the kitchen stores and the estate's medicinal supplies. "He is afraid of you," Maeve said. "He has been afraid since the night I cooked that pheasant and your palate began to return." Because your memory is tied to your senses, and the more you taste, the more you will remember about the night you fell ill. He cannot afford for that to happen. Cassian leaned back in his chair. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his jaw and the dark circles beneath his eyes, evidence of the 3 years of sleepless nights that had hollowed him from the inside. "You came to my household under a false name," he said. "You deceived my housekeeper, forged a reference, and cooked for me without revealing your connection to a man I dismissed in disgrace. By any measure, I should have you removed from the estate and reported to the magistrate." "Yes," Maeve said, "you should." "But if what you are telling me is true, then I dismissed an innocent man, allowed a thief to manage my household for over a decade, and spent 3 years eating meals prepared by cooks who could not restore what was taken from me, while the one person capable of doing so was living under a false name in my own kitchen." He picked up the ledger and held it for a moment, weighing it in his hands the way one weighs a decision that cannot be undone. "I will not arrest you," he said, "and I will not dismiss you. We will return to Blackwood Hall together, and you will continue as my cook. Pendleton will see nothing unusual. Meanwhile, I will arrange for you to access the estate's financial records. If he purchased the Gentian route through the household accounts, there will be a receipt. If he embezzled funds, there will be a trail." He set the ledger down and met her eyes across the table. "We will find the truth, Miss Thorne, for your father's name, and for my own." Maeve held his gaze. The fire had burned low, and the first gray light of dawn was pressing against the window behind him, turning the fog outside from black to silver. She extended her hand across the table, an unusual gesture from a woman of her station, and she knew it, but this was an unusual arrangement, and ordinary courtesies no longer applied. Cassian looked at her hand, then took it. His grip was firm and brief. The accord was made. They returned to Blackwood Hall separately. Cassian rode ahead and entered through the main gate at dawn, as though returning from an early morning ride, a habit he had kept sporadically over the years, giving the household no reason to question it. Maeve followed 30 minutes later, approaching from the kitchen garden and slipping through the same window she had left by. She changed her dress, pinned her cap in place, and was standing at the kitchen stove by the time the first maid came downstairs to lay the fires. Nobody remarked on her absence. Nobody had noticed. 2 days passed in careful, deliberate silence. Cassian and Maeve did not speak to each other directly. Their arrangement required distance, the appearance of a duke and his cook maintaining the ordinary hierarchy of a great household. Cassian took his meals in the private dining room, sent his compliments through the footman, and made no further requests to see the cook in person. Maeve prepared each dish with the same precision, continuing the gradual restoration of the Duke's palate with subtle shifts in her seasoning. A trace of saffron here, a whisper of smoked salt there, each one designed to coax another layer of memory back to the surface. Pendleton, meanwhile, appeared to have settled. He carried out his daily duties with his usual efficiency, attending to the household accounts each morning, supervising the estate's tenant correspondence each afternoon, and dining alone in his quarters each evening with the door closed. If he suspected that his sabotage of the white pepper had been discovered, he gave no sign of it. On the 8th day, Cassian made his move. He summoned Pendleton to the study after breakfast and informed him that he intended to host an intimate gathering for 6 of the estate's most senior trustees, men who oversaw the legal and financial affairs of the Keverell holdings across Derbyshire. The dinner would take place on the 11th day, 3 nights hence, and Pendleton was to manage every detail of the preparations personally. "I want the silver plate service from the East Cabinet," Cassian said, reading from a list he had written that morning. "The burgundy table linens, fresh candles throughout the hall, and I will need you to compile a summary of the estate's accounts for the past 5 years, income, expenditure, tenant rents, and all supplier contracts. The trustees have requested a full review." Pendleton received the instructions with a measured nod, but Maeve, who had been informed of the plan in advance through a note left inside the flower bin, knew that the request for a 5-year financial summary would consume the steward entirely. Compiling such a report meant hours spent in the estate office with the account books spread across his desk, cross-referencing figures, reconciling entries, and preparing documents for inspection. It would occupy his days and most of his evenings until the dinner itself, which meant his nights would be spent sleeping, deeply, exhaustedly, without the energy to patrol the corridors or monitor the movements of a kitchen cook. On the 8th night, at midnight, Maeve lifted the latch on her door and stepped into the darkened corridor. Cassian had left a single key on the ledge above the kitchen doorframe, a brass skeleton key that opened the estate's financial records room, which occupied a locked alcove at the far end of the grand library on the 1st floor. He had placed it there during the afternoon while Pendleton was occupied with the tenant correspondence, and Maeve had retrieved it during the evening while preparing the Duke's supper. The library was vast. It stretched the full length of the east wing, its walls lined floor to ceiling with shelves of leather-bound volumes arranged by subject and date. Maeve had never entered the room before. Servants were not permitted in the library without direct instruction, and the scale of it stopped her for a moment as she stepped through the door. Moonlight fell through the tall arched windows, casting long, pale rectangles across the Turkish carpet and illuminating the gilded spines of 1,000 books that she would never have time to read. She crossed the room quickly, her stockinged feet silent on the carpet, and found the alcove at the far end. The door was paneled in the same dark wood as the library walls, designed to blend in rather than stand out. The brass key turned smoothly, and the door opened into a narrow room lined with wooden filing cabinets and a single writing desk. Maeve lit the stub of candle she had brought with her and began searching. The cabinets were organized by year, each drawer labeled in Pendleton's precise handwriting. She started with the year of the feast, the year her father had been dismissed, and pulled the drawer open. Inside, she found neatly bundled stacks of receipts, supplier invoices, and household expenditure records, each one stamped with the Keverell estate seal and countersigned by the steward. She worked methodically, the way her father had taught her to work in the kitchen, one ingredient at a time, in the proper order, with no step skipped. She compared each receipt against the entries in her father's recipe ledger, matching purchases to preparations, verifying that every item Corin Thorne had recorded could be accounted for in the official household records. It took her nearly 2 hours. The candle burned down to a pool of wax in its holder, and she replaced it with a second stub from her apron pocket. Her fingers were stiff with cold. The library had no fire at this hour, and the handwriting on the older receipts had faded to a pale brown that was difficult to read by candlelight. Then she found it. Behind the final wooden panel at the back of the deepest cabinet, a panel that appeared fixed but shifted when she pressed its lower edge, she discovered a separate bundle of receipts that had been deliberately hidden from the main filing system. They were tied with black cord rather than the standard twine, and the paper was of a different quality, thinner, cheaper, the kind used by merchants who preferred not to keep formal records. Maeve spread them across the desk and read. The first receipt recorded the purchase of 2 ounces of concentrated gentian extract from a supplier in Sheffield, dated 3 days before the feast. The buyer's name was listed as A. Pendleton, acting on behalf of the Keverell estate. The stated purpose was medicinal stores. The cost had been charged to the household's general supply account and buried among a long list of routine purchases, soap, lamp oil, boot polish, where it would attract no scrutiny. The second receipt, dated 1 week later, recorded a transfer of £12 from the estate's food supply budget to a private account at a bank in Chesterfield. The authorizing signature was Pendleton's. There was no corresponding entry in the main account books. The third receipt was the same, and the fourth, and the fifth, a pattern of small, careful withdrawals stretching back over several years, each one modest enough to escape notice on its own, but together forming a steady current of money flowing from the Duke's household into the steward's private holdings. Embezzlement, systematic, patient, and meticulously concealed. And the gentian purchase, the proof that Pendleton had acquired the exact substance that destroyed the feast and ended her father's career, sitting at the very center of it all, like a rotten seed buried in an orchard of stolen fruit. Maeve gathered the receipts, wrapped them in a clean cloth from her apron, and tucked the bundle inside her bodice, flat against her ribs where it would not shift or crinkle. She closed the cabinet, replaced the hidden panel, locked the alcove door, and returned the brass key to the ledge above the kitchen doorframe. Then she went back to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and pressed her hands together until the trembling stopped. She had the proof. Her father's name could be cleared. The man who had stolen his life and his reputation was sleeping 2 floors above her with no knowledge that the walls he had built around his crimes had just been opened from the inside. 3 more days until the gathering. 3 more days of silence, of cooking, of keeping her face steady and her hands useful. Maeve lay down, pulled the blanket to her chin, and closed her eyes. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Hall, she slept without dreaming. On the 9th morning, Pendleton changed. It was subtle, the kind of shift that most people in the household would have overlooked entirely. Mrs. Calloway did not notice it. The footman did not notice it. Even the kitchen maids, who crossed paths with the steward several times a day, saw nothing unusual in his manner. Maeve noticed. She was carrying a tray of freshly baked bread rolls from the kitchen to the serving corridor when she passed the open door of the estate office. Pendleton was seated at his desk, the 5-year financial summary spread before him in neat columns. His pen was in his hand, but he was not writing. He was staring at the page in front of him with the fixed, unblinking expression of a man performing arithmetic that keeps producing a number he does not want to see. Maeve walked past without slowing, but she held the image in her mind the way she held a recipe, each detail preserved for later examination. Pendleton's left hand had been resting on the open drawer of his desk, the drawer where he kept his personal correspondence, and at the edge of the desk, partially covered by a stack of account ledgers, sat a fresh sheet of writing paper, already folded once, and sealed with a drop of plain brown wax rather than the Keverell estate seal. He was writing to someone outside the household, privately, urgently. She delivered the bread to the serving corridor and returned to the kitchen, where she prepared the Duke's morning tea with steady hands and a racing pulse. Something had unsettled Pendleton during his work on the financial summary. Perhaps he had discovered that the hidden panel in the records cabinet had been disturbed. Perhaps he had counted his concealed receipts and found the arrangement slightly altered. Maeve had been careful, extraordinarily careful, but a man who had spent years hiding evidence would know the precise position of every document the way a miser knows the exact count of coins in his strongbox. A single receipt turned a 1/4 inch from its original angle would be enough. Or perhaps it was something simpler. Perhaps the act of compiling 5 years of accounts had forced him to confront the cumulative scale of his own theft, and the approaching dinner with the estate trustees had triggered a fear that could no longer be managed through patience and routine. Whatever the cause, Pendleton was no longer waiting. He was acting. Maeve found an opportunity to warn Cassian during the late morning. The Duke had requested a pot of broth to be delivered to his study, a habit he had developed over the past week, using the pretense of meals to receive information without drawing attention. Maeve carried the tray upstairs herself, set it on the side table beside his writing desk, and spoke in a low voice while pouring the broth into a porcelain bowl. "He is writing a letter. Private seal, brown wax. I believe it is addressed to someone outside the estate." Cassian did not look up from the book open on his desk. To anyone passing the open study door, it would appear that the Duke was reading while his cook served his meal. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth reporting. "Did you see the address?" he asked.
The paper was folded. I could not read it without entering the room. Cassian turned a page. "Pendleton maintains a regular correspondence with a magistrate in Chesterfield, a man named Hargrove. They have known each other for many years. I always assumed it was a professional acquaintance related to estate legal matters."
"And if it is something else?"
"Then the letter must not leave this estate." He lifted his teacup, took a sip, and set it down. "The afternoon post coach departs from the village road at 3 o'clock. Any letter sent from the estate must pass through the stables first. The groom carries the outgoing post to the gate, where the courier collects it on his route. I will be in the stables at 2:30. Maeve gave a small nod, collected the empty tray, and left the study without another word. The hours between noon and afternoon moved with the particular slowness of time observed under pressure.
Maeve prepared a cold luncheon for the household staff, cleaned the kitchen surfaces, and sorted the dry goods for the following day's meals. Through the kitchen window, she could see the stable yard, a square of cobblestones bordered by the carriage house, the tack room, and the main stable block where the estate's horses were kept. At 2:10, Pendleton emerged from the side door of the main house. He was wearing his outdoor coat, a long, gray wool garment that he reserved for formal errands, and carried a single envelope in his left hand. He walked briskly across the courtyard toward the stables, his breath forming quick white clouds in the cold air. Maeve watched him approach the head groom, a weathered man named Corbett, who had managed the Keverall stables for over 20 years. Pendleton handed him the envelope with a brief instruction that Maeve could not hear through the glass.
Corbett accepted it, tucked it into the leather post satchel hanging by the stable door, and returned to his work. Pendleton stood in the stable yard for a moment longer than necessary, scanning the courtyard and the windows of the main house with the quick, assessing gaze of a man confirming that he has not been observed. Then he turned and walked back inside. At 2:30, Cassian appeared in the stable yard. He had come from the direction of the east garden, carrying a riding crop and wearing his tall boots, giving every appearance of a gentleman about to take his afternoon ride. He greeted Corbett with a casual word, patted the neck of his bay gelding, and then, almost as an afterthought, reached into the post satchel and withdrew the single envelope. "I will inspect the outgoing correspondence today, Corbett. I want to review what is being sent on estate business before the trustees' dinner." Corbett, who had served the Keverall family long enough to know that a duke's requests were not questioned, simply touched his cap and returned to brushing the gelding's flanks. Cassian examined the envelope. It was addressed to Mr. Justice Hargrove, Chesterfield. The seal was plain brown wax, unmarked. He broke it open and read. Maeve could not see his face from the kitchen window, but she saw his hand tighten around the paper, and she saw him fold the letter once, twice, and slide it into the inside pocket of his riding coat, with the slow, controlled precision of a man suppressing a reaction he could not afford to show in public. He mounted his horse, rode a short circuit around the estate's perimeter, maintaining the appearance of his afternoon routine, and returned to the stables 20 minutes later. He did not come to the kitchen. He did not send for Maeve. The message arrived after supper, tucked beneath the lid of the butter crock that Maeve collected from the cold store each evening. A single line, written in the Duke's hand on a torn strip of paper. He requested a warrant for your arrest. The charge is forgery of a parish reference. The letter names you as Prudence Marsh. He does not yet know your true identity. The letter will not reach Chesterfield. The document is now in my possession, along with the evidence you recovered. We proceed as planned. Maeve read the note, committed it to memory, and burned it in the kitchen stove. 2 more days. The trustees would arrive on the 11th evening. The table would be set, the meal would be served, and the man who had spent a decade stealing from his master and destroying innocent lives would sit in the same dining hall where it all began, unaware that every dish placed before him was a step in a reckoning he could no longer outrun. Maeve banked the kitchen fire for the night and began planning the menu. On the 11th evening, the great dining hall of Blackwood Hall was lit as it had not been in years. Every candle in the twin chandeliers had been replaced with fresh beeswax tapers. The burgundy table linens Cassian had requested lay pressed and smooth across the oak surface, and the silver plate service, polished by 3 maids over the course of an entire afternoon, caught the light and scattered it in bright points across the walls. Hothouse flowers had been arranged in low crystal vases along the center of the table, their scent mixing with the warmth rising from the kitchen below. 6 trustees arrived between 6:30 and 7 o'clock. They were men of standing in the county: 2 solicitors, a retired judge, a land agent, and 2 senior members of the Derbyshire banking establishment who had managed the Keverall family's finances for over 3 decades. They gathered in the drawing room for sherry, exchanged the usual pleasantries about the weather and the roads, and were escorted to the dining hall at 7:15 by the footman. Pendleton oversaw the seating with his customary precision. He positioned each guest according to rank, adjusted the placement of the wine glasses by fractions of an inch, and ensured that the bread baskets were filled and the butter dishes properly chilled. He wore his best dark coat, the one reserved for formal occasions, and his manner was composed, efficient, and entirely unremarkable. If he was anxious about the letter that had failed to reach Chesterfield, he concealed it perfectly. He had likely assumed the post had been delayed by weather or a missed coach, and that his correspondence to Magistrate Hargrove would arrive within a day or 2. He had no reason to believe otherwise. Cassian took his seat at the head of the table and welcomed his guests with a brief address. He thanked them for attending at short notice, acknowledged the approaching Christmas season, and expressed his desire to review the estate's affairs in their company before the year's end. His tone was warm and unhurried, and the trustees settled into their chairs with the comfortable expectation of a pleasant evening. Below them, in the stone kitchen, Maeve was cooking the most important meal of her life. She had chosen the menu with absolute deliberation. Every dish she prepared tonight was drawn directly from her father's recipe ledger, the same courses, in the same order, using the same techniques and ingredients that Corin Thorne had prepared on the night of the ruined feast 3 years ago. Roasted pheasant with juniper and thyme, venison medallions in a wine and bone marrow reduction, root vegetables glazed with honey and rosemary, a clear consommé garnished with chervil, and for the final course, a poached pear in spiced cream, the exact dessert that had ended the evening in disaster when the bitter gentian had turned the cream rancid on the guests' tongues. Tonight, every dish would be flawless. Every flavor would ring true. And when the final course was served, the contrast between this meal and the one that had destroyed her father would be impossible to ignore. The first 3 courses were served between 7:30 and 9 o'clock. Maeve worked in focused silence, plating each dish with the care her father had taught her. Clean edges, balanced portions, garnishes placed with intention rather than decoration. She sent each plate upstairs through the serving hatch and listened to the faint sounds of conversation filtering down through the floorboards. At 9:30, the footman returned with the dessert instruction. Cassian was ready for the final course. Maeve prepared the poached pears, 6 of them, peeled and simmered in a bath of cinnamon, clove, and white wine until they turned translucent and golden. She spooned the spiced cream into individual porcelain ramekins, placed a pear at the center of each, and dusted the surface with a fine powder of crushed almond and candied ginger. Then she removed her apron, straightened her dress, and carried the tray upstairs herself. She had never entered the great dining hall during a formal dinner. The protocol of the household forbade it. Kitchen staff remained below, and the footman managed the service above. But Cassian had arranged it in advance. When Maeve appeared at the door with the final course, the senior footman stepped aside without challenge and held the door open for her. The conversation at the table paused.
6 pairs of eyes turned toward the kitchen cook, who had entered the dining hall carrying the dessert tray as though she belonged there.
Pendleton, standing at his usual post beside the sideboard, looked up. His expression shifted. A fractional tightening around the mouth, a narrowing of the eyes, and Maeve saw the precise moment when he understood that something about this evening had departed from his control. She served each guest personally, placing the ramekins with steady hands and a quiet word of courtesy. When she reached the head of the table, she set the final dish before Cassian and stepped back. Cassian rose from his chair. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the table, "before we finish the evening, I must bring a matter of serious consequence to your attention. I ask for your patience and your professional judgment." He reached beneath his chair and produced a leather document case that he had placed there before the guests arrived. From it, he withdrew 3 items and laid them on the table in a row. The first was the bundle of hidden receipts Maeve had recovered from behind the panel in the records cabinet, the purchase of gentian extract, and the series of private bank transfers stretching back over several years. The second was the sealed letter Pendleton had attempted to send to Magistrate Hargrove, the letter requesting a false arrest warrant for a woman named Prudence Marsh on fabricated charges of forgery. The third was Corinne Thorne's recipe ledger, open to the page that documented every ingredient used on the night of the feast, proving beyond question that no bitter herb had been part of the original preparation. 3 years ago, Cassian said, my head chef, Corinne Thorne, was dismissed from this household after a formal dinner was ruined by a substance introduced into the food. I believed at the time that the error was his. I was wrong. He picked up the first receipt and held it so the trustees could see the signature at the bottom. This document records the purchase of concentrated gentian extract, bought 3 days before the feast by my steward, Archambault Pendleton, and charged to the household supply account under the category of medicinal stores. Gentian was never used in the kitchen. It was never requested by the chef. It was purchased for the sole purpose of contaminating the meal and ensuring that Corinne Thorne would be blamed for its failure. The room was utterly silent. Every trustee had stopped eating. Every eye had moved from Cassian to the documents on the table, and then, slowly, inevitably, to the man standing beside the sideboard. Pendleton had gone pale. His hands, which had been clasped behind his back in their usual position, had dropped to his sides. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again, producing no sound. Cassian laid out the remaining receipts one by one, narrating each entry, the private transfers, the falsified accounts, the years of systematic theft concealed beneath the routine of impeccable service. Then he held up the intercepted letter, and when he suspected that his deception was at risk of discovery, he attempted to have an innocent member of my staff arrested on forged charges, using a corrupt magistrate with whom he has maintained a private correspondence for years. Cassian set the letter down and turned to face his steward directly. Mr. Pendleton, you have served this household for 15 years. You were trusted with its finances, its reputation, and the welfare of every person who lived and worked under this roof. Do you wish to speak? Pendleton's jaw worked silently. His eyes darted from the documents to the trustees, to the door, and back again, searching for an exit that did not exist. He said nothing. The morning after the banquet broke cold and gray over Blackwood Hall, the kind of December dawn that offered no warmth and made no promises. Frost had sealed the windows overnight, and the chimneys trailed thin columns of smoke into a sky the color of old pewter. At 7:30, 2 constables from the county arrived on horseback. They had been summoned the previous evening by the most senior trustee, Mr. Alderton, the retired judge, who had dispatched his own coachman to the nearest constabulary station within an hour of the confrontation. The law moved slowly in rural Derbyshire, but it moved with certainty when a retired judge placed his personal authority behind the request. Pendleton was found in his quarters on the 2nd floor. He had not attempted to flee during the night, though Cassian had posted a footman outside his door as a precaution. When the constables entered, he was sitting at his writing desk in his shirt sleeves, his coat folded neatly over the back of the chair, his boots polished and placed side by side beneath the washstand. His personal effects had been arranged in 2 orderly piles, clothing on the left, papers on the right, as though he had spent the night putting his affairs in order with the same mechanical precision he had applied to everything else in his 15 years of service. He offered no resistance. He spoke only once to the senior constable, as his wrists were bound with cord. "I should like my coat, if it is permitted. The morning is cold." The constable allowed it. Pendleton put on his grey wool coat, buttoned it to the collar, and walked down the main staircase between the 2 officers, with his chin level and his gaze fixed on the middle distance. He did not look at the servants who had gathered in the entrance hall. Mrs. Calloway, the footmen, the housemaids, the kitchen girls, all of them standing in silent rows along the corridor, watching the man who had managed their lives for over a decade being led out through the front door of Blackwood Hall for the last time. He did not look at Cassian, who stood at the foot of the stairs with his hands clasped behind his back. And he did not look at Maeve, who stood in the doorway of the kitchen corridor, still wearing her cook's apron, her dark hair pinned beneath her cotton cap, her face entirely still. The constables helped Pendleton into the back of a covered cart that waited in the courtyard. The senior officer confirmed the charges to Cassian in a low voice: embezzlement of estate funds over a period of approximately 9 years, forgery of financial documents, procurement of a noxious substance with intent to cause harm, and the attempted procurement of a fraudulent arrest warrant. The case would be referred to the county assizes, where formal proceedings would follow in the new year. The cart pulled away down the gravel drive. The iron gates of the estate closed behind it, with a sound that carried across the frozen gardens like a bell struck once and left to fade. Cassian dismissed the household staff with a brief word of thanks and asked Mrs. Calloway to ensure that the morning routine continued as normal. Then he walked through the entrance hall, past the empty study where Pendleton had sat each morning for 15 years, and out through the glass doors that led to the estate gardens. Maeve was already there. She stood at the edge of the formal garden, beside the stone bench that overlooked the south lawn. The frost on the grass was beginning to soften in the thin morning light, and the hedgerows that bordered the garden path were threaded with silver cobwebs, frozen stiff in the cold air. Her breath came in small white clouds, and her hands were tucked inside her shawl for warmth. Cassian approached and stood beside her without speaking. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence that follows the completion of something difficult, when the body and mind are still catching up with the fact that it is finished. "Your father was a remarkable man," Cassian said eventually. "I knew it when he was alive, and I failed him. That failure belongs to me, and I will carry it. You were deceived by someone you trusted. My father understood that. He should not have had to understand it. He should have been heard." Maeve did not argue the point. There was no need. Cassian was not offering excuses. He was stating a debt, plainly and without decoration, the way a man of conscience does when he recognizes that regret alone is insufficient. "I intend to make a public declaration," he continued. "A formal statement to the parish, the county registry, and the trustees, clearing Corin Thorne's name of all charges and restoring his reputation as the head chef of this estate. The announcement will be recorded in the estate's official history and entered into the county records so that no future generation can repeat the slander." Maeve looked down at the frozen grass. A small muscle in her jaw tightened, and she pressed her lips together for a moment before speaking. "He would have appreciated that. He cared about his name more than anything he owned. When he lost it, he lost the part of himself that kept him standing." "Then we will ensure it stands again." Cassian reached into the pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded document.
It was written on the estate's formal stationery, sealed with the Keveril crest in dark blue wax, and signed at the bottom in his own hand.
"This is a letter of appointment," he said. "It offers you the permanent position of head culinary architect of the Keveril Estates, a title that encompasses the management of all kitchens, menus, and food preparation across the household and its associated properties. The position reports to no one except me. The terms are yours to set." Maeve took the document and unfolded it. She read it slowly, her eyes moving across each line with the same careful attention she gave to her father's recipe ledger. When she reached the bottom, she folded it again and held it against her chest. "Culinary architect," she said quietly. "My father would have laughed at the title." "Your father would have earned it 10 times over, as have you." She looked up at him. The morning light had shifted, and the frost on the garden hedges was beginning to melt, sending thin streams of water down the dark green leaves, like tears shed in relief rather than grief. "I did not come here for a position, Your Grace. I came to clear my father's name." "And you have done so. The position is a separate matter, offered because this household needs someone whose skill and integrity I can trust without reservation. You have demonstrated both under circumstances that would have broken most people I have known." Maeve held his gaze. The formality between them, the distance of rank and station that had governed every interaction since her first night in the kitchen, was still present, but something beneath it had shifted. They had conspired together, shared risk together, and carried a secret through the halls of a house that had wronged them both in different ways. That kind of experience did not dissolve the boundaries of their world, but it altered the ground on which those boundaries stood. "I will accept," she said, "on one condition." "Name it." "The kitchen will carry my father's name. Every recipe served in this household will be prepared from his ledger, with his methods and his principles. The meals that come from this estate will belong to the Thorn tradition, and everyone who sits at your table will know it." Cassian considered this for a moment. Then a faint trace of something appeared at the corner of his mouth, the nearest thing to a smile that Maeve had seen from him in all the days she had spent under his roof. "Agreed." He extended his hand, just as she had done at the inn in Oakhaven 6 days earlier. She took it. The grip was firm, and it lasted a beat longer than the first time. Maeve released his hand, tucked the letter of appointment into her apron pocket, and turned back toward the kitchen entrance. There was bread to bake, stock to prepare, and a full household to feed. The work of a great kitchen did not pause for justice or ceremony. It continued, steady and essential, the way her father had always said it should, one meal at a time, made with honest hands. She pushed open the kitchen door, tied her apron, and began.